Okay, so what we'd like to do now is hear from you all. I'd like to ask for one person to comment from each group. I'd love for that to be somebody from the audience, if possible. Otherwise, we'll call upon our long-suffering panelists to speak on behalf of their groups. We'd like to hear one major idea, question, takeaway, suggestion for our next steps that came out of each one of these discussion groups. So starting again in the order of the presentations, what about from the producer-oriented discussion? And there's a microphone that...
So it is on. One very big idea that is probably not going to be met by this group was talking about the role of income inequality and what that plays. If incomes are so unequal among people in the food system, farmers and laborers in particular are having low incomes in the food system compared to marketers and retailers, how can it be good food? And then a maybe easier question to answer. This is something that came up at the very end. Is from a marketing perspective, if someone is doing marketing research, is it players like, is it Sandy Purley? Is that, yeah, like, and Eric Cartwright driving demand for local produce in institutions, or is it the consumers in those institutions driving demand, and how can we capitalize on whether it's a key player, do you need to identify a key player, or do you need to get to consumer demand to increase volume of local food moving through institutions?
Okay, so it seems to me like this microphone is working for recording, the one you have, Jill, is working for recording only and not for projecting in the room. So I'll repeat in very shorthand form what I think Jill said. She really surfaced two ideas. One having to do with income inequality among players in the food system, focusing in particular on low incomes of producers and laborers in the system as compared to certain other players, such as retailers and other people in the chain of food distribution. That was one thing. And the second thing was a question about, does consumer demand drive behavior of suppliers, or the other way around, sort of which?
No.
No?
If it's key players within those institutions that drive it, or the consumers, like the students within the,
Right.
institutional food service.
Mm-hmm, or both. Okay, great. What about, I forget which group was next. Oh, the consumer perception group. Ask for somebody to tell us some of the great things you talked about in that group.
We were just discussing how we hoped we didn't have to report. Because we covered a lot of ground, so.
Just give us one or two of the most important, most compelling ideas that you talked about.
Well, we had a lot of discussion back and forth, I guess, about the tensions between resistance to conventional agriculture and local small holding, kind of producers, and what contributed to that, what part of it was perception, what part of it was life circumstances, and how it's a very complex thing, so that people tended to hold on to their ideologies, which kind of is anathema to trying to figure it all out, since it's a very complex and multivariate thing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And, oh, you summarize, you've got the notes. The consumer perception group talked a lot about tensions, resistance to conventional production methods, and local small producers, what contributes to the perceptions that are at work there, and an important notion being that we have our perceptions and that we are sort of wedded to them, and that makes it hard to break out and think about doing things in another manner. Okay? Next was the Place and Landscape Group. Where is that group? Anybody from that group? Now, you don't want Labo to have to speak for you. Dan? Okay, good.
Okay. Hi, I'm Kat, and we talked about a lot of different things, so I'm trying to wrap my head around the coolest things. So we spoke a lot about women and minorities in agriculture and the role that those people play, and how even though they might be leading agriculture and might be like the greatest source of farmers, like they're not women and minorities aren't really represented in like the face of agriculture. It's pretty much always a white dude. So there's that. But so we also talked a lot about we talked a lot about place and accessing Indigenous knowledge, like specifically how we could be better local eaters, like even in Columbia, Missouri, like how to distribute information on where to find wild asparagus and where there are persimmon trees, and how to connect all of the people that have that knowledge, and kind of to get everyone in the community more invested in our local food system. So our coolest idea was coming up with a Columbia like local foods access map, where like everyone brought their information to the table and we could compile like an actual physical map of like where to find certain agricultural products and like how much you should take and not to trample on the plants themselves, like all of the knowledge that would need to be there. And I'm going to stop talking, but we talked about a lot of awesome things.
That's great. So one of the issues about Indigenous knowledge and drawing on knowledge of people who are not recognized perhaps as the leaders or drivers of the system, even if they're numerically sort of at the forefront, is how to capture that knowledge and put it to use. Somehow the organized systems of knowledge that we have about farming and agriculture and food and eating don't match up so well, perhaps with that Indigenous knowledge. So one thing we could perhaps try to learn, and one idea that that group came up with, is just here in Columbia, Missouri, trying to capture some of the knowledge that does exist, and that some of us in this room and other people we know have that knowledge, where wild foods are, how to harvest them, how to do that without harming the crops themselves or the surrounding land, how to use those things once we do harvest them. Really a cool idea, trying to come up with some kind of a map.
Okay.
It's just
yeah.
for the recording.
Sorry.
You have to shout.
Yeah, so that's a great idea, and I just wanted to comment quickly because it's already been done in some ways, and I think the energy can kind of continue from this discussion. I know mulberry trees were mapped recently in town, and there was some mulberry harvesting associated with that. So really bringing those kind of people together that have that knowledge is a fantastic idea. And CARES, the Center for Applied Research in Environmental Systems, might be a good resource in helping to execute that project and make those maps. And if you go to communitycommons.org, I think they have some tools there that could be useful and growing this project and bringing people together in an online forum to create this kind of mapping tools and share this knowledge that would lead more people to knowing about where this food that is out there. As Hannah said last week, it's everywhere. It's all around us. So.
Thank you for those suggestions. The organizations were called CARES and Community Commons that we might look into to try to facilitate the compiling of that knowledge. The next group would be the Ownership and Control Group. If we could have somebody to report from that group.
No, I went to grab my notes.
Got 'em.
And I'm offering you guys, Sharon, wear your morels knife.
And I have a mulberry tree in my new backyard.
I think our tension that we identified is that there seem to be a lot of different camps within the university system in particular, and the question is how to integrate them and how we can bring approaches together. And so one thing we looked at was looking at the problem as a system, and we talked about some of the values-based value chains as a potential idea, but how do you actually optimize everybody's perspectives? Is that right? Perspectives or objectives. There we go. How we optimize everybody's objectives and something like that. And there was some research done in industrial engineering and looking at how you could model and actually optimize multiple objectives. And economics does that too. But then we got on to the conversation of how would you do something around ownership or fairness? How do you even define those kinds of things when there's multiple measures of success? And so that was our discussion, I think.
And the learning group. We hear from the learning group.
We also talked about a lot of different things, but the things that stuck out in my mind were trying to find ways to effectively ensure that students are taking away from the messages you give them. And how do you do that? Do you go through their peers? Is it parental education? Is it just long exposure and experiences outside in a garden, or taking trips to orchards, things like that? So what's the most effective way to do that? Is it a combination? And then also looking at adults and asking them about their experiences and what stuck out to them the most as children learning about food, and what was most effective with them, and using that to model our education system in regards to food off of. So, is there anything else?
Assessment, are we properly assessing food education, and would a more adequate assessment of food education be easier to sell to administration of a school, especially since they're so focused on assessment, especially if we're doing garden classes? How can those be assessed? How can their learning about farm to table be assessed by the school system in general? Is an experiential assessment, or could it be on paper? That's what we kind of ended with in our discussion.
Thank you. So that group really took up, I think, Chris's invitation from his presentation to try to make the leap from education that is delivered to learning that takes root in a person, thinking about who are the people who are best positioned to deliver messages that will be received, what different modes of learning, whether experiential or other, and then the key piece about assessing. How would we know if we had succeeded in fostering learning in young people about food systems? Those are all terrific ideas. I guess the last thing I would ask, you have another suggestion? You're not going to wrap up, are you? I was going to ask for next steps.
Okay.
Anything else you want me to do? Okay. I take my direction. So what I will do now is ask from anybody for any idea, whether related to the group you were in or not, about next steps that this group or others on campus could or should try to take to move the ball forward. I think, speaking for myself, but maybe some of you share this sense, that, smart, highly motivated, well-intentioned people get together and talk about these things, and then we sometimes spin our wheels. So we're really very eager to hear, even of small-scale things, that would represent meaningful next steps to try to continue to understand these questions better and to do something about them. So I'd be happy to hear from anybody.
We have a limited amount of funding to take some small steps.
But we can start.
Yes. So we have a limited amount of funding. So, don't let that be a barrier.
So if it's to bring in some, if you know of somebody who would be a really terrific speaker from the outside world, and who it would take some money to bring in, or whatever it might be. Love to hear those ideas. Yes.
There's a big week on campus in the spring called Sustainability Week for students, and they're actually looking at speakers to bring in. And one of the suggestions was, and I don't know his name, but I've watched his TED Talk. He's a gorilla farmer,
Ron
Ron
Finley.
Ron Finley. And maybe looking at people like that to bring in, or like maybe someone from this group could get involved and jump in on Sustainability Week planning, or I don't know, engaging student groups is a really good way to ensure progress and to ensure that people are getting messages across. I think it's really needed on Mizzou's campus.
That's a great suggestion, that we all get involved in the student-led Sustainability Week, which will happen in the spring. I think those of us who have organized this panel in particular very much share your sense. That's why we're so excited to have these young scholars and practitioners speak to us today, because that is what has to happen. Other ideas?
Well, our group also talked about sharing information, sharing stories, and particularly from people with women and other, of course, it wouldn't have to exclusively women, but since women are the main food producers around the world, maybe starting with that, but particularly people from other countries, because they have a different type of knowledge, and might be interesting to hear their, record how they're preparing different foods, and how we, I guess, integrate some of their lifestyle and insight with ours.
Okay, so the notion is to find ways to capture and share some of that knowledge from women, from people around the world, and so forth, surrounding their food traditions, knowledge about how to prepare things, and so forth. Others?
Well, this is really small, but if you haven't gone to the CDL Garden yet, go to the garden and tell Chris what you think, and give him some ideas for authentic assessment, and take a look around at what's happening on campus and in and around the community.
Okay, so we should pay attention to what's right here under our own noses on campus, and visit the Child Development Lab, among other places, see what all is happening there.
What about, would people be interested? Sorry. He'll tell me about it. What about things as a food systems network? Are there some things we could do in the future? Would it be interesting to do like study circles or something like that on a monthly basis with around the topic of good food? Would that help us think through some of our researchable ideas or things like that? I mean, would that be something that people would be interested in? And does anybody have suggestions how we might organize something like that? Or if they've experienced something like that in the past, any comments on that?
I think this one back there.
As an answer to your question, one thing you could, there's so many different groups and organizations that do all kinds of things related to food here. Somehow a newsletter, getting the organization together to put out some kind of a newsletter to let people know what's going on and to ask input, I think that would be very useful with a wide distribution. That would be very, very helpful for those of us who aren't deeply into the food movement.
And tomorrow, Friday from 2 to 3 on the Tiger Patio, there is the second installment of Mizzou Eats, which is a rogue student group that has been formed to pair dialogue sessions about food issues with some basic reskilling classes. So we had our dialogue session on ethical meat production and consumption last Friday, and this coming Friday we will be grilling meat and tempeh, and making some tacos and learning about cooking proteins. So it's just outside Memorial Union. It might be a little cold, but the food will warm you up. Yeah.
It's a $5 donation to cover the cost of the food, and then we're also going to donate any extra that we have to the Tiger Pantry. This Friday at from 2 to 3. Yep, at the what's it called?
Tiger Patio.
Tiger Patio.
Okay, so we've all learned one thing, and that is that there is a place on campus called the Tiger Patio. I don't know if any of us had ever heard of that before. And meanwhile, without wanting to call a halt to this discussion, I think food may have arrived. I seem to see some activity out in the hallway. So the refreshments that we promised you perhaps have arrived. Thank you all so much for coming.
Wait,
oh, I'm sorry.
In addition, another regularly occurring event. Another regularly occurring event is the first Thursday of every month at 8 a.m. 8 a.m. at Cafe Berlin, there's a sustainable ag breakfast, and it's just a time to gather and talk about your activities related to sustainable ag. And eventually we'll, in addition to having announcements, have wonderful conversations too, right? Lots of stuff going on. Oh yeah, maybe we'll have a happy hour too.
All right. Well, I hope you all continue to share ideas among yourselves, and please join us for some refreshments if they are in fact here.
I would just like to add, coming from outside of the university, a general call for more community involvement. I think there's a lot of good work to be done out there outside the university, so I just wanted to add that. Thanks.